The baby's cries filled the cramped airplane cabin, drawing restless sighs and annoyed looks from nearby passengers. The man holding the infant was clearly struggling, dark circles under his eyes, a shaking hand trying to rock the child while fumbling for a bottle that wasn't working. He whispered soft words, his voice breaking from exhaustion and something deeper grief. The woman seated beside him watched silently for a moment, her own heart aching at the sight. She wasn't anyone special, just a young woman returning home after losing her job and with more worries than she could count. But seeing the helpless father, something stirred in her, a quiet instinct that came not from comfort but from compassion. She leaned closer and asked softly, "May I?" He hesitated, then nodded, too tired to protest. Gently, she took the baby into her arms and began humming a soft, trembling lullaby her mother used to sing to her when life felt too heavy. The sound was pure, fragile, almost like a prayer. Slowly, miraculously, the child's cries faded into small hiccups, then quiet breaths. The cabin settled again, passengers exhaling in relief, but only the man noticed the tears welling in his own eyes. He looked at her as if seeing light after a long time in the dark. "He hasn't slept through a flight since his mother died," he whispered. The words carried pain so raw that the woman didn't know how to answer at first. She just smiled faintly and whispered, "Maybe he just needed a song." She handed the sleeping baby back to him carefully, brushing a tear from her own cheek when she thought he wasn't looking. For the rest of the flight, they didn't speak much. Yet something passed between Emma, an unspoken connection between two people carrying quiet grief. She didn't know who he was, didn't know his name, and didn't expect to ever see him again. But he couldn't stop glancing at her, wondering how a stranger's voice could bring peace not just to his child, but to his heart that had forgotten what peace even felt like. When the plane landed, he turned to thank her properly, but she was already gone, disappearing into the crowd with her small worn-out bag and tired eyes. He stood there for a long moment, holding his sleeping son and feeling an ache he couldn't explain. The billionaire widower, a man known for power and success, had been undone by a simple lullaby. For years he had hidden behind business deals and silent walls, trying to fill the emptiness his wife's death had left behind. But that song, her voice, had touched something human in him again. It reminded him that not everything precious could be bought, and that kindness, sometimes, came from those who had nothing to give but their heart. Days turned into weeks, and yet he couldn't forget her. Every time his son cried at night, he'd hum the same melody, the one the stranger sang, and the baby would smile in his sleep. One evening, as he sat by the crib, he whispered, "I wish I knew her name." He had people, connections, the power to find Ania, but this time, it wasn't about control. It was about gratitude, about something that felt almost sacred. Still, fate works in quiet ways. Months later, while taking his son to a small diner far from his usual world of luxury, he heard that same voice again. It was faint but unmistakable, carried by the sound of soft humming from behind the counter. He turned, and there she was, wearing a simple apron, hair tied messily, serving coffee to a table with the same gentle patience she'd shown in the plane. She looked up, surprised, when she saw him. For a moment, neither spoke. The little boy recognized her first, stretching out his hands, babbling in joy. She smiled and came closer, taking the child as if it was the most natural thing in the world. The man placed a small music box on the counter. It played the same lullaby. "You gave my son peace," he said softly. "Let me give you some too." She shook her head, eyes glistening. "You already did," she replied. "You reminded me that kindness still matters." They began to meet often after that, not as billionaire and waitress, but as two people trying to find light after loss. He'd stop by the diner with his son, sometimes helping her close up late at night, sometimes just sitting in silence while she hummed a tune that had brought them together. She learned that he had built his empire after losing his wife to illness, drowning his pain in work and wealth. He learned that she had left her dreams behind to care for her sick mother, who passed away not long before that flight. Both had been broken in their own ways, both pretending to be strong until fate sat them side by side on that airplane. In time, their lives began to intertwine naturally, quietly. The boy grew attached to her, reaching for her every time she was near. The man found himself smiling again, laughing softly at moments he never thought he'd feel again. He offered her help, a better job, a home, a chance to start over, but she hesitated, afraid to step into a world that wasn't hers. "I don't belong there," she whispered once. He looked at her with a kind of sadness that came from understanding. "You belong where you're loved," he said. When she finally agreed, it wasn't for the comfort or the wealth it was for the little boy who'd fallen asleep in her arms that first day, and for the man who had learned that love wasn't about possession, but about healing. They built a new kind of family, one born not from perfection but from shared pain and compassion. And sometimes, late at night, when the child stirred in his sleep, she'd sing that same lullaby again, softer and steady, a song that once quieted an airplane now filling a home with peace. He'd watch her from the doorway, remembering that flight, remembering how one simple act of kindness had changed everything. For a long time, he had believed that love ended with loss, but now he knew the truth. Love doesn't die, it waits quietly in unexpected places, like a song carried by a stranger's voice at 30,000 feet. And sometimes, that's all it takes to find redemption, to sing for someone else's pain until both hearts finally rest. Months later, he found her again, working double shifts at a small diner on the edge of the city. The place smelled of coffee and tired dreams, filled with people who came not for fine food but for warmth. She moved between tables with quiet grace, humming softly under her breath, the same lullaby that had once silenced his son's cries thousands of feet in the air. Her eyes looked tired, her hands worn, but there was still gentleness in the way she smiled at strangers and refilled their cups. He stood by the door for a long time, watching her, unsure of what to say after all those months. The billionaire who once commanded boardrooms and made headlines now stood frozen by something as simple as a woman's song. When she finally noticed him, her steps faltered, and the small smile on her face vanished in surprise. "You?" she whispered, unsure if her memory was playing tricks on her. He nodded, walking closer, his little boy holding his hand, grinning with that innocent recognition only children have. Without saying much, he placed a small music box on the counter between them. She looked down, confused, until he turned the tiny key and let it play. The same soft tune filled the diner, the lullaby she had sung that night on the plane. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The clatter of plates, the chatter of customers all faded into the quiet melody. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. "You gave my son peace," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. "Let me give you some too." But she shook her head, wiping her eyes gently. "You already did," she said. "You reminded me that kindness still matters." Those words struck him harder than he expected. He had spent years buried under grief and wealth, forgetting what simple kindness felt like. And now, here was this woman who had lost as much as he had, reminding him of it with nothing but honesty and warmth. He sat down at one of the tables, his son climbing into her arms as if he belonged there. The boy giggled, playing with the small pendant she wore, and for the first time in so long, the man laughed too. It was quiet at first, unsure, but real. "You're still singing," he said, his eyes soft. She smiled faintly. "It's the only thing that never left me." They talked for hours that day about small things, about life after loss, about hope that comes when you least expect it. He learned that she had lost her mother not long before that flight and had been working ever since, holding on to music as her only comfort. She learned that he wasn't just a widower, he was a man who had built his empire out of loneliness, filling the silence of his home with money instead of love. When she tried to hand back the music box, he stopped her gently. "Keep it," he said. "It belongs to the one who gave the song its meaning." She didn't know how to respond. It felt strange, this moment between them, too big for words, too fragile to touch. Over the next few weeks, he began visiting the diner often, sometimes with his son, sometimes alone. The staff started noticing the way his eyes softened when she came near, the way the boy's laughter grew brighter each time she sang. Slowly, they began to share more of their lives. She showed him the small notebook where she wrote lyrics she never dared to sing in public. He told her about his late wife, how she used to hum to their baby before she got sick. There was no rush between them, No dramatic declaration, saw just two broken souls learning how to breathe again. One rainy evening, when the diner was almost empty, she walked him to the door, holding his sleeping son in her arms. The sight made his throat tighten. The same woman who had calmed his child on that airplane now carrying him as if he were her own. "You don't have to keep coming here," she said gently. "You've already done more than enough." But he looked at her, eyes shining with sincerity. "Maybe I come because it feels like home," he said. Her heart trembled at those words, but she didn't know how to answer. She had spent so long running from attachment, afraid that love only led to loss. Yet this Mona, this stranger who had once looked lost himself, made her believe that maybe love wasn't about holding on forever, but about finding peace in someone's presence. Days passed, and the world outside kept moving, but inside that small diner, something beautiful began to grow. He would bring his son crayons and sit him by the counter while she sang softly, her voice turning the dull hum of the city into something almost magical. People noticed. They smiled more, tipped better, stayed longer just to listen. And one night, after closing, he stayed behind to help her clean. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore, it was full of unspoken understanding. As she wiped down the tables, he finally said, "I can't stop thinking about how that one flight changed everything." She looked up, surprised by the raw honesty in his tone. "Maybe it was meant to," she said softly. "Sometimes life sits strangers beside each other for a reason." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her. "Then stay," he whispered. "Be part of the family you helped save." Her breath caught in her throat. No one had ever asked her that before. For a moment, she looked at the little boy sleeping in the booth, his tiny hand clutching the edge of her apron, and tears filled her eyes again. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't have much to give." He stepped closer, shaking his head. "You've already given everything that matters." That night, she didn't answer with words. She simply reached out, placed her hand over his, and smiled through her tears. From that day forward, their lives slowly wove together like the verses of a quiet song. She became the melody in their home, the laughter that filled the silence, the comfort that money could never buy. The boy grew to call her Mama, and each time he did, her heart felt whole again. Sometimes, when the nights were long and memories of the past returned, she would take out the music box and let it play, the lullaby echoing through the house. He would sit beside her, holding her hand, and together they would watch their son sleep a peaceful, loved, and safe. For the first time since his wife's passing, he felt complete again. Not because someone replaced the love he lost, but because she taught him that love could begin again in a different form. And she, who once thought her songs were just whispers meant for herself, finally realized that her voice had given life back to someone who had forgotten how to feel. The woman who once sang to calm a crying child on a plane had unknowingly sung herself into a familia, a place where her song turned into love, and where her heart finally found its home.